Okay, folks, this is a good one. This is our eating clean lesson, and I think most people learn a lot from this lesson that they didn't realize. So here we go. One of the major sources of toxins in our environment is actually from our food supply. Some of the crops that are used to feed humans as well as the livestock are treated with chemicals. Our livestock may be treated with hormones or unnecessary antibiotics. Food, when it's processed, often eliminates or destroys the nutrients, and it actually may expose the food to bacteria. Processed foods especially can often include added sugars, artificial sweeteners, artificial colors, flavors, and preservatives, and these can be toxins. Even our food preparation techniques may contribute to the loss of nutrients or create unhealthy compounds within the foods. So eating clean helps us promote optimal health. It helps us ensure that our foods have the highest nutrient quality and the lowest amount of toxins. So let's start with animal sources of foods. That includes meat, eggs, and dairy, as well as products that have ingredients that are sourced from animals. And this may be supplements, it may be functional foods, it may be processed foods. So an example would be like whey protein or egg protein. So those foods, if they're sourced from unhealthy animals, can also be unhealthy. So some of the considerations. First, we need to look at their living environment. So have the animals been contained in cramped, enclosed facilities, never getting any exercise, never getting any sunshine? Or have they been allowed to roam freely in their natural habitat? Are they living in unsanitary conditions? Then we look at their diet. Have they eaten their normal natural diet, or have they been fed a restricted diet of foods that they would not normally eat and that may not meet their nutritional needs? We also need to look at their medical condition. We want the animals to be free of illness and make sure they haven't received unnecessary antibiotics. Now, I underscore the word unnecessary here because sometimes animals get sick, and if they get sick, they may need antibiotics. But the difference is, if they're cramped up in a facility, stacked on top of each other, and one of them gets sick, then they're all going to get sick. So what these conventional farmers do is they basically they add antibiotics to their food so that they're getting antibiotics every single day just to ward that off. Where if they're out roaming in a pasture, then number one, they're going to be less likely to get an infection or sickness because they're getting exercise, they're getting a natural diet, they're getting sunshine. But if you think about the herd mentality, it's easier to distance yourself from a sick animal if you're out in the natural habitat, and they will naturally, instinctually do this. So there's that. Then we also need to consider life cycle. Have these animals been allowed to age and grow naturally, or have they been given growth hormones to stimulate their weight and muscle mass? And then we also have to look at treatment. Have the animals been treated humanely, or have they been subjected to conditions that promote stress? Stress equates to energy, and that energy is definitely a component of the food we eat. So we don't want to eat animals that have been constantly stressed. Then let's talk about plant food sources, and that includes fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Some of the considerations here are the agricultural practices. So what type of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers have been used? How is soil health being maintained? Because soil health is directly correlated to nutrient quantity and quality. Are plants grown in a regenerative environment, or are they monocrops? And a monocrop is where I plant the same plant over and over and over, rows and rows and rows, acres and acres and acres. And what that's going to do is it's going to strip that soil of key nutrients and never put them back in, because I'm growing the same thing over and over again. So rather than monocrops, we want to see plant combining, where we are growing several plants together that provide nutrients to each other and don't strip all the same nutrient. Or we want to see crop rotations, where that soil is used in alternating years to grow different crops that can replenish it. So then we also want to look at the source of the seeds for our plants. Are they native? Are they tolerant to the region that they're in? Adapted to their growing environment? Are they non-GMO? And there is a whole GMO video that you may want to go check out. It goes into a lot of detail about that. For plants, we also want to look at their environment. Are they exposed to environmental toxins from like an adjoining farm or local water sources? Because you can have, and we have had, contamination of even organic farms where there was a livestock farm up the hill and all the waste from that livestock farm just floated down into the plants. So we definitely want to look at environment of our farms. We also want to look at harvest timing, make sure that the plants are harvested at peak nutritive value, not before, and are they seasonal? And then we want to look at transportation. So are they locally grown? Are they being shipped across the country or even from a different country? And in that case, are they subjected to toxic screening methods before reaching the seller? Then we want to talk about seafood, which is a little less straightforward. Sources of seafood, or seafood sources of food, include fish and shellfish. So seafood can be wild caught. I mean, it's caught in its natural marine environment. That includes lakes, oceans, and rivers. Or it can be farmed, meaning it can be raised in tanks or other controlled habitats. Both methods have their pros and cons. Either can be safe and sustainable or detrimental to both the environment and to consumer health. So it's a little more complicated. So considerations, regardless of the method, look at, is the diet diverse and natural? Does it include their key nutritional requirements? Are they able to move about freely and consistently, which is important to their health? Are they exposed to toxins in their environment? So like levels of mercury are actually higher in the ocean, and they are going to be higher in larger fish. So smaller fish, less toxic, but as you go up the food chain, it accumulates. And then chemicals, like from water runoff and stuff, might be actually higher in other habitats besides oceans. And unfortunately, what we've found is that drugs are present in both natural ocean and lake environments and river environments. And anything in the water can get into your seafood. So we also want to look at the methods for capturing the fish. Are they humane? Are they harmful to the environment? Are they contributing to like overfishing, which reduces fish populations and drives up prices? Then we also want to look at transportation. Are they being transported long distances to the seller or consumer? Because that can contribute to the buildup of possible toxins, bacteria. And then are they given antibiotics to prevent disease? Because again, we don't want unnecessary antibiotic levels in our food. So let's talk about the word organic. And the word organic is, as it's applied to food and food products, is actually a label that has been designed for regulation and marketing to indicate certain characteristics. So they do affect how the food was grown, raised, and or processed. And there's a link on here on this slide that goes into all the detail about each of these different areas, and I'm going to summarize a few of them. Okay, so for meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products, these can be called organic if the livestock has been raised according to those USDA regulations, defining grazing conditions and the use of organic feed and the lack of hormones and antibiotics. Plant foods can be called organic if the growing practices adhere to the USDA regs regarding synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, preservatives, or other chemical applications. A processed food, sitting in a box on the shelf in your grocery store, may be called organic if at least 95% of the ingredients are sourced from organic ingredients. So, not necessarily 100%, but at least 95%. So, one thing I wanted to note, that a label of organic, with respect to like a food source, does not necessarily indicate that it was grown, raised, and produced using a regenerative or sustainable method. It does mean typically that the food is free of chemical agents, hormones, antibiotics, and it's non-GMO. So let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, plants may still be grown as monocrops and called organic if they're not sprayed with chemical pesticides and herbicides. But as we said, monocrops aren't really healthy for the soil. Not if we don't have companion planting and we don't have regeneration. So just because that spinach is organic doesn't mean it was raised using regenerative and sustainable methods, right? And then chickens is another example, because they may still be cage-free but not pasture-raised. But if they're fed an organic diet, then they can still be labeled as organic. Well, that diet could still be a grain, even if it's non-GMO, that's not their normal diet, because chickens need protein, they need worms and bugs and that kind of stuff in their natural diet. So even though it's an organic, by the USDA standards, chicken, it may still not have been raised in the optimal conditions for optimal health. Yeah, it's complicated. So processed food's pretty easy. And research shows us that the more processed foods we consume, particularly ultra-processed foods, the more our risk for chronic disease goes up. Whole foods are foods in their natural state, and their nutrients are intact, and those nutrients work together. Minimally processed foods are in a nearly natural state, and most of the nutrients are still intact, and they've only been slightly altered. So examples of this are removing the inedible parts or crushing, like the outside shell of a nut, drying or roasting, freezing, and pasteurization. Those are considered minimal processes. Processing does change the food from its natural state, and it may remove or damage nutrients. Oftentimes when that happens, the producer will add back to the food to compensate for the flavor, the texture, or the nutrient deficits. Those ingredients that they add back may or may not be healthy, and may or may not be in the same balance as those nutrients were in the natural food in its whole state. So some of the things that get added back are sugar, sweeteners, and salt, artificial colors and flavors, hydrogenated fats or trans fats, artificial preservatives, emulsifiers or stabilizers. So emulsifiers are basically ingredients they add to keep ingredients combined, like oil and water, which will separate if they don't. And then stabilizers are ingredients added to improve texture and stability. And ultra-processed foods include many, many ingredients. If you look at their ingredient lists, they're long. They're mostly artificial or substances extracted from other foods, a lot of chemicals we don't recognize, so we really, really don't want to eat ultra-processed foods. So we know that systemic inflammation is a significant contributing factor to most of the chronic disease. Systemic inflammation can alter genetic processes, suppress immune function, and harm mitochondria. So we want to minimize those inflammatory foods in our diet. That includes processed foods, like low-fat foods, low and zero sugar foods, and beverages, most commercial baked goods, refined flours, and then those heat-processed plant and seed oils. Gluten. Gluten is a protein that's found in wheat, barley, and rye, and interestingly enough, it's inflammatory to about a third of the population. They can't digest it well, and so it causes inflammation in the intestines, even people who are not celiac. So the percentage of people that are celiac is more like 2% of the population, but we're talking over 30% of the population has trouble with gluten. Dairy. Dairy contains casein, which is a protein, and some people have an allergy to the protein. It also contains lactose, which is a sugar, and as we get older, our ability to digest lactose decreases. That's why people get lactose intolerant as they get older. Corn derivatives. So these are particularly high in sugar, and they cause spikes in insulin and blood pressure or blood sugar. But also, you'll learn this in the GMO video, about 90% of the corn crop in the United States is genetically modified. So we definitely want to also avoid ingredients made from corn like that high fructose corn syrup, corn flour, and corn oil. Sugar and sweeteners can be inflammatory. Artificial ones certainly, but even the natural healthy sources of sugar, such as honey, maple syrup, raw sugar, and coconut sugar, need to be moderated so that we can control and have healthy blood sugar levels. Trans fats, studied to directly cause cancer and contribute to unhealthy cholesterol. Don't eat foods with trans fat. And then artificial chemicals and additives. We should definitely avoid those as much as possible. These are foreign substances, so our body doesn't exactly know what to do with them, so it can trigger an immune response, which is inflammatory. And then other considerations. We also need to pay attention to our food prep and cooking methods. So foods that are fried, smoked, dried, pasteurized, or grilled at high temperatures produce what we call advanced glycation end products, and those lead to inflammation. Big contributor to like joint pain. Notice that says high temperature, so that means that not every smoked or dried or grilled food is unhealthy. The trick is we want to use lower temperatures and longer times to prepare those foods to make them healthy. We all love our grilled and smoked and dried foods. Overcooking foods can also lead to a loss of nutrients, particularly those vitamins that get easily destroyed by heat. So try to steam or use stir frying for short periods of time to cook your foods. Using lower temperatures for longer times, we talked about that. Use fats and oils that are appropriate to the temperature and cooking method. So there are certain fats that withstand higher temperatures, like avocado oil, coconut oil, butter, ghee, tallow. Olive oil and your seed oils tend to need lower temps for cooking, or they'll become rancid and unhealthy. We also want to use pans that don't have that lovely, easy, nonstick coating. Teflon coated pans are toxic, 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 toxic. So what we really want to be using are stainless steel, cast iron, and ceramic. And I know that whole nonstick thing is so easy, but a trick that I found, I don't remember where I found this, it works for my stainless steel and my cast iron, is that you allow the pan to heat up without anything in it. Then you add your cooking fat and allow that to heat for a bit before you ever add food. And in general, that's very successful so that you don't get the food to stick. Also, try not to store foods in plastic containers. Use glass, silicone, or ceramic. And never, ever, ever heat food in the microwave in a plastic container, because all the toxins in plastics just leach into the food. So to always consume the cleanest, highest quality food would be great, but most of us have limitations, financial, physical, availability, any of that make that kind of impractical. So what are some of the things we can do to kind of make our foods the cleanest that they possibly can be? Well, one thing you can do is grow your own food. There's a lot of vegetables that can be grown in small pots, or hydroponic containers, and they don't take a lot of space. So even if all you have is a little balcony on your apartment, you can stick a tomato plant out there, right? Or some spices like basil or something. So that's something you can do to kind of dissuade some of the cost. You can look for local farmers markets or farmers or CSAs in your area. Talk to them about their farming practices. Support them and get some good healthy food from them. You can prioritize your spending. So look at the foods that you eat the most, and then look at how contaminated they are likely to be with chemicals or whatever. And then spend your organic money for the foods that either will be the most toxic or that you eat the most. And then you don't have to buy organic for the other ones. So kind of weigh your eating habits. And the EWG is a great resource. They publish something called the Dirty Dozen every year. And that's the list of foods, produce foods, that are the most contaminated with pesticides or toxins. And they also have like a Clean 15. So see where your most consumed foods are on those lists. For processed foods, find processed foods that have fewer, cleaner ingredients. Frozen foods are often cheaper than fresh, and they can be just as nutritious, maybe even more sometimes, because typically they're harvested at the peak of their nutrition and immediately frozen, so they don't have to be transported or processed. They can be substituted for fresh foods in a lot of things, like casseroles and stir-fry dishes. You can also leverage like bulk stores, Costco, Sam's Club. Some of those have larger quantity bags. So look at stuff that you eat a lot and you can buy more of it and you're not going to waste it. That's a good option. And then there's online markets like Thrive, Misfits, and Ugly Foods, which Thrive provides normal foods, but Misfits and Ugly provides foods that they can't sell to a grocery store because for some reason we as consumers think our food has to look perfect. So you can often get those foods at a lower price. Some of them have like subscription purchase options, which make the food even cheaper, because if you have that on a subscription basis, then you get a discount. So, and a lot of these alternatives have organic and clean food alternatives. So it will kind of help. All right, so to recap, our diet and environment should be considered when choosing clean food for animals and seafood. Farming practices should be considered when choosing clean food for plants. We should reduce processed foods that we eat and avoid all ultra-processed foods. We should avoid inflammatory foods. We also need to consider our food prep, cooking, and storage methods. And there are practical things we can do to reduce the burden of eating clean. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something, and check out some of the other videos on the channel.